Welcome to the ExecMBA podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Gopika Spaenle. Gopika is the Managing Director for Professional Degree Programs with the Darden Career Center, and she and I recently connected to talk more about the important role networking plays in the Executive MBA and Part-Time MBA student job search. As always, if this episode is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to the ExecMBA podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Gopika Spaenle. Gopika, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brett. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you here. Great to have you back on the show. How is everything going?
It's going well. We have kicked off to another busy fall, full of activities, full of welcoming new students, which is always fun. And of course, continuing to work with students already on the program. So it's been packed with activities, but very energizing as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so we have some part-time MBA students who will be finishing up in December. We also have part-time MBA students who will be finishing in May of 2025. So we'll have our first graduates from the part-time MBA program in the not too distant future. We also have the Executive MBA class of 2025 who are now in their second year in the electives period. And I mention all of this because it feels like when graduation is in view, you kind of enter that final year of your course of study in these professional degree programs. That's really when a lot of the career process will accelerate, particularly if someone's looking to make a switch.
That's correct. I mean, of course, we see people making transitions across the program as well, even their first or second year for the part-time MBA program. But yes, certainly it gets accelerated, I would say, more time and focus towards the end of their final year.
Well, are there any updates, any news, career-related news you would want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, well, just in terms of what we're in the midst of offering right now. So we're in the throes of various career exploration activities. So we always, at this time of year, try to help particularly our newer students, better understand the landscape and different industries, different functions. So last week, for example, one of my colleagues hosted an overview of the consulting industry. Tonight, some students are joining a colleague of mine to talk more about Batten Institute and what support there is for those interested in entrepreneurial activities. So we run these sessions, these alumni panels, and these other sort of industry discoveries through the end of the year, calendar year. And then we're also gearing up for a PAC, which is the professional advancement course, a required course for our working professional students that really helps them advance their thinking on their career agenda. So the team and I are busy putting together both the curriculum for that, but also thinking about some of the speakers and some of the alumni that will take part in that event. And then finally, we are busy supporting some of the graduating class, back to the class of 2025, who are in the midst of some career transitions and taking part in more traditional post-MBA recruiting efforts and interviewing right now for positions. So it's, as I said before, full of activities, but all good stuff.
Lots of different things. We talked about the Professional Advancement course, or PAC as it's known here on the podcast before. That's a course that now takes place in January term, between the fall and spring semester. 10 days. It's mostly online, although there is a in-person opportunity at the very end of the course. How would you describe that course to folks who are just now hearing about it for the first time?
Well, it's really intended to provide space and time for our busy working professionals to really commit to thinking about how they see their career unfolding. And to some, that's thinking about continuing to advance in their current job or in fact, industry or company. For others, it's thinking about, what else is driving passions and interests and how they may think about making a career pivot over that time. And also, of course, people who want to start their own businesses. And so we provide both through a series of activities, structured activities, through discussions and through alumni panels, as I mentioned before, an opportunity to really reflect on and then construct, I would say, a plan, an action plan for how they would like to continue to work on their career agenda and how we, of course, as career coaches and the career team can support that. So both in-class learning and also activities. And then finally, I would say very importantly, having the alumni perspective.
Yeah, I feel like that class comes around at a good time for students. So you've been through a semester of the program, feel like you've gotten maybe your sea legs, so to speak, and you've settled in a little bit more, and now you're ready to turn your attention and kind of thinking about what's next and starting to develop a plan for that. It's one of those classes that I think I hear a lot from current students about how impactful it is for them just to have that space. It's a 1.5 credit class, but it's built into the curriculum, and it can be hard for working professional students sometimes to carve out time for these kind of career related questions. So it's nice that it's actually in the curriculum.
Absolutely. That's what we hear from students as well. Thank you for forcing me. It's a forcing function to make sure I'm working on this because this is one of the primary reasons they're embarking upon an MBA. And so we really want to make sure we're doing what we can to support that goal.
Well, Gopika, the inspiration for today's conversation is really to help people understand what we mean by network-driven search. When we talk with part-time MBA and executive MBA prospective students about how they are likely to find their next opportunity if they're looking to make a switch, change function and/or industry, we end up talking about this network-driven search and how that's really the process that will likely yield their next opportunity. But I think when people hear that, you hear it and you say, "Oh, sure," but may not quite understand exactly what that is or what it entails. And so for you, how do you define networking for students? How do you encourage them to think about this?
Yeah, and I know networking can be a loaded word for many. And we actually do spend time in PAC talking through this at greater length. But, for me, professional networking is the process of both building and maintaining meaningful relationships. And meaningful, I think, is a key word here. So, broadly speaking, how do you engage with others to learn more, to exchange information, to gather resources? One of which, of course, the benefit is greater career growth. When I think about effective networking, what does it start with? So to me, it starts with being curious, really being inquisitive, wanting to learn more from people and other individuals, and also really important to be an active listener. Beyond that, I would say it's thinking about the set of questions that you want to explore and that you want to learn more about. And then, of course, preparation is involved. Um, what the other thing I would note about networking that I think is really important, and I think helps gets at this concern sometimes that it's so transactional, is that to me, it is indeed about a mutually beneficial one. So at the end of the day, you want to, particularly over time, be helping and supporting others as much as they're providing to you as well.
Why do you think this network-driven search makes sense for part-time MBA and executive MBA students? I think this is an important sort of question. I mean, certainly we say this is how you're going to find your job, but why is this really kind of the likely way that someone's going to find their next opportunity?
Well, I would say for several reasons. First, when we think about our working professionals, and particularly those who are fairly experienced in their careers, they're likely not going to find their next role from a job that's posted in LinkedIn or Indeed. In fact, what they're looking for is the next stretch assignment for something that helps advance their career. And a lot of those types of roles are really ones you're going to learn about and be connected to through others, through conversations, through your network. And that's why we stress that so much, because we truly believe and have seen year on year that our executive MBAs and now increasingly some of our part-time MBAs are getting access to those opportunities and finding the right next fit through the process of networking and effective networking.
So when does the process of networking, kind of beginning to have these conversations, building these relationships, when does this process start for students? Because recognizing for folks who are just learning about our programs, our executive MBA program is 21 months in duration, so effectively a 2-year program. Our
Yeah.
part-time MBA program is anywhere from 28 to 48 months, although the standard pacing is 33 months, so a little less than 3 years. But when would this process of networking really start?
So I would say it should start even before you start the program, to be honest. But we see our roles as career coaches to be very much helping to build and provide that foundation of that networking. So First, I would say there are structured events, and we talked about them at the very beginning of this conversation, where we bring students and alumni together, for example, and provide those opportunities. So early on, you get exposed to the broader alumni, Darden alumni network and the community, and begin to make those connections. But I would then say through PAC, the professional advancement course, and through a variety of other programming that we offer, you will continue to do that. But it goes beyond that. And I would say it is those students who early on identify that this is how they're going to make a career transition or advance within their own career or within their own industry, that it is through that. And they see the power of having those informational interviews, of having those outreaches to people within the Darden community that really benefit. So they do it on their own alongside, of course, the efforts that the Darden Career Services team makes.
Yeah, one of the things I've been struck by, and we're obviously talking about people who want to make a switch here, but one of the things that's also curious or interesting to me is that for people who want to climb within their existing organization, there's still a lot of networking happening for those people too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the key pieces of advice that I share with students as well is particularly for those people who are climbing, as we call them, is diversify your network. I mean, particularly use this time at Darden where you're meeting people from and your classmates and other program classmates as well. Use this time to learn about other areas. Go beyond your immediate circle. Don't limit yourself to networking just within your current job or industry. You're going to probably learn a lot that will not just benefit, your own job, but potentially your company's success as well. And so I think that's an important feature.
All right. So let's say I'm a student in one of these programs. I've met with a career coach. I've got a few alums that you suggested that I connect with as a good place to start. You just reach out on LinkedIn. Do you send them an email? Like the mechanics of this. How does this work?
So it varies, and we would have sort of a customized plan of working with students. But I would say yes, LinkedIn is a good place to start. We also have the Darden Alumni Directory, which is a robust directory which provides more information on our vast alumni network. And the other place, of course, to start, and students sometimes forget, is your own classmates. Like you are in a class of, in the case of our executive MBAs, over 120 other incredible, very talented individuals who have a great network themselves, and then across programs as well. So whether it be with our part-time MBA program or residential program, there's a vast network there. But yes, what we suggest doing is starting to figure out who would be relevant contacts for you, who has, who either works in a company that's of interest to you, has a functional role or function that is of interest to you, or just has a career that inspires you. I was speaking the other day to a part-time MBA who's decided that she believes she wants to ultimately be a chief operating officer. And so we talked about what the next steps were. And part of that was starting to look at people's profiles and seeing how they rose in their career to those roles. But indeed, then starting to reach out and understand what those people do. So I truly believe a lot of it's that kind of initial research to figure out who might be on your list, and then connecting with them, ideally having an informational interview with them. So a short conversation where you are curious, back to my earlier point, where you come prepared with questions that are top of mind for you and better understand how their path is unfolded, and what advice, what recommendations that they can share with you.
So an informational interview, what are some examples of questions that someone might ask in that particular setting? Recognizing that I'm sure some of our listeners have had these kind of conversations before. And then again, kind of getting back to the idea that networking sometimes can feel intimidating to people or transactional and kind of be maybe a little icky, at least as some people kind of think about it. What does the informational interview look like in terms of questions that people might be asking?
Yeah, I think, again, they could vary, but I would imagine some of them would be about the individual's own career history, how that person, how that alum often or individual has navigated their own career to date, and then more broadly understanding, what the challenges and opportunities are at the company, the industry in general. what recommendations they have for others to kind of succeed in the same type of vein of work, what resources they would suggest, whether it's podcasts or other critical material that they suggest would be useful to get up to speed. And then, I think often as well, it's finding out who else they would recommend speaking to. So a very important question to always ask at the end of these conversations is, could I continue to connect with you, but also would you have suggestions of others who might be able to help me? So those are the types of questions that we suggest. And we have obviously further guides that we're happy to share with students once they embark on this.
And that last question about anybody else you think I should speak with, I think there's sort of an accelerating quality that happens as you have these informational calls with people. You tend to all of a sudden have a lot more people to speak with as you go forward in the process. And it sounds slow, but I actually think it moves pretty quickly sometimes for students.
Yeah, and I think the initial first few calls can be a little bit more uncomfortable, particularly if it's a completely new terrain too. But I would argue, yes, each one builds on each own. So over time, once you've had some of these initial conversations, let's say you're learning about a new industry, after a few of them, and once you've done your homework, you probably have some really smart questions to start asking and sort of next level questions. And those you can pose to other contexts. And again, it does increase. You'll be surprised at how many more people you'll be introduced to. And I would say, and we haven't talked about this as much, but I also always encourage students to be listening to what that individual is working on, because I want, again, back to this mutually beneficial partnership or relationship, what do they share that they are working with or struggling with? And can you keep that in mind as you go about your work? And if there are things that are helpful and relevant, just making sure you share that back. Because again, this is about a way to support each other.
How do you get students comfortable with, putting yourself out there, having some of these conversations that might not be the most smooth interaction where you're talking about something that you're maybe not as familiar with someone that you haven't met previously? How do you get people comfortable with that?
Well, sometimes I say start with someone familiar. Like, again, back to your class. Start with a classmate who is in the industry or in a function, a role that you're interested in. And that can be that can give you some confidence and also just be that much more informal. The other thing I would say is, have your list of questions, be prepared so you can rely on those if you do stumble a little bit. But my sense and my own experience is that most people are very happy to share more about what they know and to talk about themselves, frankly. And so, well, I think often the student might go in with certain level of concern or anticipation, nerves, whatever it might be. The truth of the matter is usually over time that, once the ice is broken, it tends to be a pretty free flowing conversation and probably much less formal than I'm even suggesting it is. I think it tends to be more of a back and forth conversation.
So it kind of brings me to asking a question about the Darden Alumni Network. Who are these people that you're reaching out to? Obviously they could be from any number of networks, but likely connecting with some Darden alums. How would you describe Darden alums to people who may not know as much about this group of people?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, broad and a diverse network across so many different industries and functions. But I would just say, in terms of approachability and willingness to help, very supportive. So my team and I are regularly calling upon alumni to support, whether with individual conversations with students or for events, for panels, all of those things I mentioned early on. And we have always found them very generous, very willing to share what they can, provide referrals as suitable as that is or as relevant, and just be, I would say, a resource and that I think our students can rely upon. So I very much encourage our students to stay in touch with alumni and reach out to them. Again, we try to make sure that we're providing opportunities to do so, but they should feel comfortable doing that on their own.
So we started talking about how you have these initial calls that lead to more conversations, but how do you cultivate these relationships? How do you maintain these relationships as you go through this process? Because I'd imagine at a certain point, you've talked to maybe 10, 15 different people. You gotta try to keep track of this and stay in touch with them. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I do think being organized here is really important. We share a template, a spreadsheet, but certainly you can use whatever process feels most comfortable to you. But you need to be tracking conversations, in part because you need to be tracking the information you're learning, what you gather from the conversation, what interests the contacts, for example, so you can stay on top of that too. And follow up because often they will provide some additional names or some resources that they suggest you look into. And I always encourage students, make sure you do that homework and then follow back up with the contact. Make sure they know what you did in response to their suggestions. And anyway, so that spreadsheet, that document, whatever you end up creating, is really important to keep yourself on top of the networking process. And then as you get closer to actually starting to think about applying for roles, again, that list of contacts is going to be super critical for you.
Why is that follow up so important? Because we talk a lot about networking, and I do think people think about it as transactional, but it's really more about building relationships. And so, why is that follow up so important?
I think that follow is important for several reasons. One is it shows that you were listening and paying attention and value that individual's time. And so showing that and showing that appreciation, I think is really important. And then in terms of other follow-up, as I mentioned before, for example, if they mention that they're working on something that's a thorny problem for them, and you find an article and you send it back to them, or perhaps there's a case you just did at Darden that you think could have relevance to them, you share that as well. It shows that we are in a relationship where there's trust being built on each side, and that there's an earnest intent to help each other. And I think that's great. I think that's what ultimately we want to see. It should be a back and forth, as I mentioned before.
So, how do these relationships, and say you've had some of these conversations, you've kept in touch, you've followed up, how do these relationships ultimately help a student once they find a role of interest?
Right. And first, I should tell you that part of the benefit here too is sometimes through these conversations, you learn about roles that aren't even posted. They're not posted yet. They're not made public yet, but they may share through a conversation to expect something. There may be a new role coming about, or just where there's going to be greater growth. So it gives you even an early alert, more so than you would have if you're just relying on what's being posted on LinkedIn or another job site. Once a role is posted, though, the network can be very powerful for a few reasons. First, I would say, they could help you with the application process. It might mean they're willing to refer you for a specific role, which obviously helps, particularly at certain companies that place a premium on that. In other cases, you might get an introduction to the hiring team, which would be valuable. With such a competitive job market and with so many applications coming through, getting that access is very valuable, and getting your application sent directly to the right team is incredibly helpful. And then I would say more than that, it's gathering insights on the company, what you might learn from a contact about what the team cares about right now, what their biggest challenges are, what their opportunities are, what the skill set they're looking for. This will all help you as you think through your application, and certainly once hopefully you get an interview, how you prepare yourself for that process. So it is helpful across a multitude of areas through the application and recruiting process.
So, one of the things that's interesting to me, is sort of listening to you talk, is this takes time. And this takes effort. People are working while pursuing their degree. They have very full plates. So, how do you help students find time to do all of this while they're trying to do school and work and life?
Yeah, and I have to be honest, like I don't know if I can help them find time. But what we try to do is see if, to the extent we can make some of this process efficient for them. And whether it is giving them advice about who to contact or helping them, with some of the follow up. I do think any student, whether they're a full-time MBA or indeed a working professional, have to realize there's a lot of time, focus, and commitment required for any job search. And certainly networking is a big part of that. And they're not necessarily shortcuts to it. It is something you need to be invested in and to be committed to making time for in your calendar. It needs to be blocked off. It needs to be something you regularly think about, and it needs to be something you hold yourself accountable for. And again, I think career advisors can help with that accountability mechanism too.
Yeah, we tell students when they think about this career part of the experience, if you're looking to make a transition, you should view it as almost like having another class in
Mhm.
terms of the time commitment and also the intention and attention that's required. It can't just be sort of like, oh, just kind of casually doing this. Like it does require bit more focus.
Absolutely. And the students that I've seen who are very focused on this, who treat this very seriously, who are thoughtful in both their preparation and execution and follow up are the ones that I see obviously have the greatest success with this. Career transitions at any stage of your career are tough, and particularly in a job market like today, which is a little volatile. So I do sometimes think students have an expectation that it's sort of like, oh, I had a call here and there, and my next job will land on my lap. And that's not how it is. It is a deliberative, focused, committed effort, which can yield wonderful benefits because a lot of our conversation today, Brad, is about a career transition or maybe the next role. But I would argue what you're building through this process are relationships that are going to last you longer than that, right? And through your career, because it's not just for your next job that you're going to have a network driven search, but probably the next five. And so thinking about this network is something that you're fostering and developing for longer term benefit is really important.
I love that perspective. The other thing that we stress with students when people ask us about career outcomes for executive MBA or part-time MBA students recognize that it's early for our part-time MBA program, but still, when you sort of think about working professional students and career outcomes, the success a student has is largely a function of their willingness to invest the time and energy into the process. The other thing that's important to remember here is being a Darden MBA is helpful, but you're also competing against a bunch of other MBA candidates. The kind of jobs that you're looking at now are very different than the jobs you were looking at before. And so having an MBA, while helpful, likely insufficient to ultimately yield that job. So you have to be doing these other things to ultimately land the job.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's everything from making sure you're market ready with your resume and your LinkedIn profile and all kind of the collateral that we talk about. Thinking about the gaps that exist. One of the things that you learn through these networking conversations, these informationals is, oh, you know what? I have a blind spot or I have a gap here. The role I'm looking for requires X skill and I have more set of Y skills. And so I need to get there. And so then figuring out how to fill that gap and address that gap over time too. So indeed it is just one part of the process, but if you're committed to wanting to make a career transition, we're certainly at Darden, the careers team, I know is very willing to help support you make that. It is a two-way street. We can offer up resources, we can offer up context and suggestions and support you along the way. But in return, you need to be there fully committed and willing to make and carve time for this.
So I want to take a slight detour here to talk about the job process for our full-time MBA students, which is different, right? So
Yeah.
they're going to do an internship between their first and second year. I think a lot of executive MBA, part-time MBA students, one of the things that you have to accept is an internship is not going to be part of the career process for our working professional students, for students in our executive MBA and part-time MBA process. I think, though, one of the things that gets lost sometimes when people look at the full-time MBA career process is that those students are also doing a ton of networking, a tremendous amount of networking to get known at these companies, to build relationships at companies they're targeting. And that is a lot like what our executive MBA and part-time MBA students have to do if they're looking to make a career transition. Anything that you would want to highlight about the full-time MBA process and this networking piece?
Well, yeah, I would concur. I think there's structured networking that residential MBAs take part in our case on grounds in Charlottesville, but there's a lot of networking that they need to own and do independently as well. For some of our industries, that means going up to New York or going to certain cities and traveling to make those connections. So they put in a lot of time. Now, granted, they're not also balancing work or a full-time job, but clearly they have other responsibilities too. So I would just say that for any professional, networking is going to be an important part of it. And I think you just need to understand and accept that early on, and realize that, back to my earlier point, there are a number of benefits to it, but you're going to need to work on it.
Yeah, and again, I always think about it in the context of the comment that I made earlier, right? It's great to be at Darden, it's great to be an MBA student, but you're now competing against other MBAs for these roles. And so how do you go about this? Well, relationships are going to be a big part, building that network, having people inside the company that you're targeting who can advocate for you or help connect you to someone who can be really helpful. That's how the process really works for a lot of people.
Agreed. And, for a number of our students, they are looking to make pivots, right? And whether it be an industry or function. And a resume it's hard to do that through a resume alone. It is through having conversations where you can tell your story, share your story, position your skill set, talk about your transferability of skills. It's through those connection points that, to your point, Brett, you then make a connection. Someone becomes an advocate. Someone realizes, gosh, I would love to have this person on my team or love to have them part of the company. And then that's going to really help propel the conversation forward. If you just rely on submitting an application through an ATS, it's going to be pretty hard, particularly in this environment.
And what's an ATS?
Sorry, an applicant tracking system.
I figured as much, but just for folks who are not as familiar with this world, applicant tracking systems, can we talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like this has come up in a few conversations. A lot of people applying. I feel like AI is now really being widely used in those applicant tracking systems to kind of sort because there's so much interest. There's anything that you would want listeners to know about, again, why networking becomes important in a world of these kind of more AI-driven tracking systems?
Yeah, well, clearly we all now have access to the same set of tools. And so, increasingly there may be a lot of resumes, submissions, and that look very similar to what the job scope is, right? People are smart. They're trying to position themselves as best as possible. So there could be a lot of competition through that, through that process. And how are you going to stand out, particularly again, if your job experience doesn't match quite the requirements of what the job is? Maybe you're close, but you're not quite there. Well, it's the way you stand out is through having substantive conversations with individuals who get to know you and believe in you and know that you have more to offer. And so again, what I often say is you may want to submit your application through that process just to get the ball rolling, but you need to make sure at the same time you're reaching out or revisiting contacts that you have at that organization, to ensure that your application gets attention.
So, what makes for a successful job search process for executive MBA and part-time MBA students? We've talked about some of the sort of key sort of fundamentals, sort of following up with people, being organized, really being intentional and giving this the time that it requires and the attention that it requires. But what are some other things that you would mention in terms of when you think about students who've been successful?
I think there's a couple of things. There's initiative, right? It's being proactive. It's not thinking just of the Darden names that maybe the coaches and I provide, but taking the next step and thinking about other ways to reach people, whether it's attending conferences. Recently, in fact, I've spoken to a number of Darden students who have made really important connections through conferences, ones both that Darden hosts, but also externally. So it's making that extra effort to go beyond just sending emails and connecting with people virtually, but actually being in person and meeting folks there. And then I would also say is, it goes hand in hand with making sure that you're more visible too. So, we can talk more about this on a separate session, but I think having a really strong LinkedIn profile and being active and contributing to LinkedIn conversations is helpful as well, because that's often how you get found during the job search process as well. Or you might in fact get some attention through that. And certainly when you start to connect with people, they're going to be looking at your LinkedIn profile. So starting to get deeper into terrains that you're interested in and becoming more vocal on them, I think is really important. And then finally, nothing beats just being persistent and patient and working against it. I mean, I think of a student I worked with last year who probably had 50 conversations with people at startups to land his next role. And, I don't think there was anything, it wasn't rocket science. It was just good old fashioned hard work, effort, good organization, and being prepared for these conversations. And he found something that he's really happy with now. And I think, full credit to him. He was incredibly focused, but also just put in a lot of blood, tears, and sweat into the process.
Yeah, I think you have to be comfortable with a certain amount of ambiguity here because you sort of think about a network-driven search, maybe the exact process, how you're going to get to the next thing. That line is not a straight line. There's going to be some twists and turns. There's probably going to be days that are great, some days that are maybe a little less great in terms of how things are going. And you have to be okay with that sort of lack of clarity.
Yeah, lack of clarity, and yes, to your point, ups and downs. There it can definitely sometimes feel a little bit like a roller coaster ride, right? You have a great conversation or maybe a great interview, and then unfortunately the next day you get a decline, and then you're back at it. And I think having a good support system is really important, whether that's personally or through classmates, and some certainly for our alumni and towards the end of our second year for executive MBAs, we have a job search group too. So how you can share ideas, but also get that support through the process, I think is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask about talking with your classmates as you're going through job transition or searching for something. I feel like that could be a really rich conversation because you're learning things, they're learning things that you can share each other's successes, but also, be there to support each other when you're maybe not having the best days. This sounds like something that you encourage.
We do to the extent that people are comfortable with it. Not everyone always is, but yes, I think it can be really beneficial. It is, first, you get fresh ideas and perspective from others who are often going through the same thing as you. Two, just have someone to commiserate with or, share notes with. So we do put those together and try to host those type of sessions, and really let students kind of run with it to the extent they want to. In some cases, they've continued it throughout their MBA program.
We'll go through a couple more questions for you here before we wrap up. But what would you want our listeners to know about the realities of making a career transition through a working professional program? Obviously, we're talking about executive MBA, part-time MBA students here. I think we feel as admissions folks, we want people to come in with a very clear picture, they understand the realities of what this looks like. So how would you describe that to someone?
Yeah, I guess first I just want to go back, and I know we've talked about this a lot. So, but that time management is going to be critical here. That you can't underestimate the amount of time that's required for this, regardless of whether you're doing an executive or part-time MBA program. The other thing I would say is you need to be really reflective or reflect on your experience to date and really what you want to achieve. I think that's very important, and be realistic with that as well. As you start to do your research, you'll get a better sense of what that market looks like, what the opportunities look like, and you need to be constantly reevaluating potentially what your goal is. Just as a side note, changing industry function and potentially even geography within a short period of time is very hard for anyone. And so I want people to come in thinking about what might be one change they want to make across their period of time or after they graduate, because it may be indeed a staggered approach to making a career transformation. It is not done overnight. And then, the final thing I would say is you will probably need to think about how you reposition your narrative. Like, how are you going to talk about your personal brand in a new way, particularly if you're headed in a different direction? And that's something we, of course, can support you with. But indeed, if you're planning to make a big career pivot, you're going to need to figure out how to tell your story such that it matches your new destination.
Yeah, I feel like it's important for students maybe to have a few paths that they're considering to diversify
Yeah.
their options. To your point, like there can be significant degrees of difficulty if you're trying to change a lot of things. So maybe what's a smaller change you can make? Maybe kind of like medium change. Like I always encourage people not to think about like all the eggs in one basket. Basically, like how do you ultimately
Yeah.
diversify to give yourself options to make sure that
Yeah.
you have.
Absolutely. So first, sometimes students share their target company list and it's like three or four companies. And I always say, no, you can't start with just that. I would always say widen your aperture, think about a larger set of companies you're interested in. Clearly you need at some point to focus in on a smaller group, but starting broad makes sense. And then to your point before, I think maybe you put an initial focus on trying to change your industry, but staying with your function and leveraging that experience. So that it is a two-step process. So first you move into an industry and then maybe ultimately move to a different function. Um, I think we can certainly help you learn more about what your target destination is, but I think clear expectations and understanding that in any job market, but certainly today's job market, there's a lot of competition and there's a lot of applications for any given role. And so you just need to go a little bit with your eyes wide open to that and realize it's going to take both work and effort on your part. A strong community and network is really important. Being prepared clearly, but appreciating that there's going to be bumps in the roads, and maybe to some extent being satisfied that you've made some transition across your time. And again, thinking it as a multi-step process and not something you do in one go.
Yeah, to your point, you mentioned when you think about cultivating these relationships and building this network as kind of a longer term proposition, this is, this is the next thing for you. It's not likely the last thing for you. So you might be putting yourself on a path that will eventually get you to where you want to go. So maybe bigger picture, longer term thinking is useful here too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Gopika, last question for you. What's a piece of advice, some tips that you would share with our listeners, something for them to think about as they think about their MBA journeys or career paths?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, as I started this conversation, it's never too early to think about broadening your network. So, for anyone listening who wants to, first of all, reach out to me by LinkedIn, very happy to connect with you. But beyond that, think about other ways to get connected, again, to diversify your network, other groups, associations, alumni groups from your perhaps undergraduate that you could start to already get connected or reconnected to. I think that's an important piece of this. And then second, I would say start reflecting on your key skills and, what's going to be your distinctive advantage as you head into potentially a job search and what makes you different and what can you continue to work on. And then the final thing I would say is, um, there's always an opportunity to learn about new terrains and industries even before you start an MBA program. So along with doing research, think about projects or stretch assignments that you could even get in your current work that start to give you an insight or start to give you exposure to different parts of the business that you may want to strive towards. So yeah, those are a couple of thoughts.
Well, Gopika, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. I think it's a really important one for our prospective students considering our part-time MBA and executive MBA programs to hear, because I think what oftentimes I run into when I talk with prospective students is, they might look at the full-time MBA process and see a very structured process, of an internship, all that kind of stuff, and may wonder, can you make a switch through a professional degree program? The answer is yes. The way you do it is through this network-driven search that we've talked about. Of course, students can also participate in recruiting for post-MBA full-time positions in their final year of study. But this network-driven search is really going to be at the heart of this process. And I think for a lot of people, they're not sure how it starts, how you work through it, what's required. And I feel like we covered a lot of that today. So thank you for your expertise.
Absolutely. I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Brett.
And that was my conversation with Gopika Spaenle, Managing Director for Professional Degree Programs with the Darden Career Center. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at exec, that's EXEC, MBA at darden.virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.